All right, welcome everyone. Today is what is today? Wednesday, the 26th of February, 2025. And this is the Cluster API office hours meeting. Cluster API is a sub-project of Kubernetes SIGs, and as such, we follow their meeting guidelines, which can basically be summarized as please treat each other as you would expect to be treated, or explicitly so, please be kind to each other. And if you have a question or would like to talk, please raise your hand and I will call on you. So at the beginning of our meetings, we like to take a little time to welcome new attendees or new community members who'd like to introduce themselves. So I will be quiet for a few seconds. And if you would like to introduce yourself, please, raise your hand or unmute and say hi. Please, Neha.
Hi, I'm Neha. I'm from VMware by Broadcom. I work with Fabrizio, Christian, Stefan downstream in VMware in vSphere Kubernetes team.
Very cool.
That's it.
Welcome, Neha. All right. I am not seeing other hands going up or people unmuting, so we will move on to the next part of our agenda here. So open proposal readouts. I don't know if we have any, just the in-place updates, and I'm not sure there's been any change since last week. So I will move on unless someone has something to say about the in-place updates. Okay, not seeing any hands going up, so I will move on. Discussion topics. Looks like we just have a couple today. The first one, Stefan, with the removal of old API versions and CRDs. So please take it away.
Hey, can you open the issue, please? Thank you. Okay, so I don't know who still remembers this issue. Probably a lot of people. Who knows? Okay, so we had I guess multiple attempts to get rid of Alpha 3 and Alpha 4. And then I had to eventually even revert it. I hope this is our final attempt at this. So what's the problem here? So basically what we did over time is we introduced more and more API versions. Nowadays we have basically beta 1, which is our current storage version and the only version that is actually available because it's the only one that we serve. So that basically means it's the only one where you can do like a get in the list call and the API server actually gives you the objects. We still have Alpha 3 and Alpha 4 in our CRDs, but we only have them because the API server might want to convert between Alpha 3 and Beta 1 or Alpha 4 and Beta 1. And this is because technically it's possible that on one side there might be still objects stored in etcd with Alpha 3, for example, or there might still be managed fields within, I don't know, a cluster object or something, which are using Alpha 3. And then basically when you do a patch request on the object, it also has to go through conversion because the managed fields are using still have ownership information for the old version of your CRD. Super fun stuff. So TLDR, we had those two problems. Why we could not just drop Alpha 3 and Alpha 4. If you would just drop it today without any sort of change, a bunch of stuff would just start failing. So what do we have to do before we can drop the old API versions? Sorry, just stay up there for a second. I'm now getting to actually looking at text. So the first thing we have to do is, that's the point 1 here. We have to ensure that all the custom resources of a CRD can still be read from etcd after we remove an API version. So that essentially means we have to make sure that all the custom resources in etcd are actually stored there with the current version. So that's the first step. We have a partial solution for this at the moment because basically Cluster Cuddle does this automatically. If you use Cluster Cuddle, then Cluster Cuddle does it automatically. If you don't use Cluster Cuddle, then there's nothing there. There's also something in upstream Kubernetes, which is called a storage version migrator, which is alpha since Kubernetes 130. And you can basically use it to trigger storage version migrations, but basically you create a CRD. So you create a CRD like, hey, please migrate this custom resource and then migrates from one storage version to another. So it's not just automatically working. You have to actively deploy objects to trigger the storage migration there. And it's still alpha. So it's I hope it makes it, and I hope it becomes GA and all of that. But at the moment, it's not like, oh yeah, it just takes care of the problem for us. Because it's alpha and because it explicitly requires people to trigger the migrations. So that's part 1. Part two is about the managed fields that I already mentioned. So essentially, we have to make sure that before we drop an API version, we have to remove, we have to go through managed fields of all custom resources, and we have to drop all the entries with the old API version. If we don't do this, there are two potential things that can happen. Basically, let's say you have an object, it has alpha3 in there, and then we're just going to drop alpha3 from our CRD. So if the next request is a server-side apply, so kubectl -- server-side true, you will just get an error back from the API server. So this one here in the middle somewhere, request to convert CR to an invalid group version. So basically, as soon as you drop that API version, you would only get errors if you do any sort of server-side applies. If you do a client-side apply, that's even more fun. Basically, what will happen is the API server will log an error, should not happen, fail to update managed fields, and then we'll remove all managed fields from your entire object. So if you look at the object afterwards, there are no managed fields anymore. They're just gone. So yeah, also not good. So we have to do this step as well. Then under wise is important. Basically, so why do we even care about getting rid of the old versions? There are two answers to this. One is it's maintenance effort. Just keep like old API versions forever. We always have to implement conversion, even though we don't care about those versions anymore. And the other thing is essentially that as long as we still have objects with the old API version in etcd, as long as we still have managed fields there, and even if that's not the case, we get a lot of requests on our conversion webhook. The details are here, and also I created an upstream issue and linked it here, so I would just skip over that a little bit. So how do we plan to address this? What we want to do is essentially we want to embed an additional controller in our providers that takes care of this. So let's see. Yeah, maybe I should actually go step by step through what I wrote here. So the important thing for us is essentially we want to have something which not only works with Cluster so it's also available to folks that don't use Cluster because not everyone is using Cluster so we can't just assume that. Then it should be easy for providers like, I don't know, Kappa, CapC, CapV, whatever, that they also have something where they can solve the same problem without having to implement it from scratch. And there might be people out there who want to take care of these problems themselves because, I don't know, maybe they have too much time. So there should be a way to disable the built-in feature. Yeah. If someone has like their own ways of dealing with these sort of problems. So the fun thing is basically, as far as we can tell, there are open issues in Kubernetes. We don't know if anyone solved these problems already in a good way that go beyond like, oh, you can add like this client Go snippet to your controller, or you can run kubectl patch here and there. I mean, we also didn't build it in Kubernetes, so it's like always with community, right? But we are not aware of any solutions out there, but maybe people have something. Okay, so.
I see Stefan, Pablo has a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so I was thinking because something similar might have been brought up recently. Would that be possible to embed logic within a feature flag? That feature flag could be ready to migrate, perhaps. That would integrate with lower level components and on the control plane. And if that flag was something else, then it wouldn't be able to migrate. And the other question is same as we, for example, as we rotate certs. I think manually I would be like patching, merging the etcds, and then overwriting them to the proper one. But that's kind of hacky, right? That's why I'm thinking about this kind of a feature flag based logic and also automate the process for the future regarding CI/CD, honestly.
Okay. I'm not sure if I was following entirely. So there's a PR open currently for this. And what I'm suggesting there is basically there is a command line flag, and that command line flag allows you to disable this migration, or per default it will be just enabled. That is basically the same as a feature gate, right? You can turn it on and off. But the reason why we did not want to make this a feature gate is on one side, this flag already allows you to turn it off if you don't like it. The problem is if you make this like a feature with a feature with a feature gate, which goes through alpha, beta, and GA, we might have to wait another few years until we can actually get rid of alpha 3 and alpha 4, and we already have kept them around for like, I don't know, 2 years or so since we stopped using them. So we want to have something that we can, that we need something in place that we can actually rely on, where we don't have to wait another few years to get rid of our old versions. So I think for people who like a feature gate, they can just use the other flag that is there. It gives the same functionality. It's just, we don't have the life cycle of alpha, beta, GA, essentially. And the other question, I don't know, I wasn't really following, to be honest, what we could do with CD
I
or...
was wondering about the etcd consistency. I'm looking at this PR right now with as it's being scrolled, and it kind of looks it kind of seems like a boilerplate for something like this. But how do we assure that backward compatibility, or there is no backward compatibility? You just migrate because you know that you need to migrate, and I mean, ETC entries may get a little bit twisted or messy, certainly, and some parts of the platform wouldn't be properly working then.
Okay, I'm not sure I get the
I mean,
problem.
let's say we have the operator with that CRD and we need to migrate it. Is there backward compatibility assured within the logic in the PR opened? Because from what I saw quickly, it seemed like something boilerplate where you create a new controller and new CRD manager and so on. But where is that logic that would check for compatibility? Like,
What do you mean with compatibility in that case? What has to be compatible with what?
of the base types of the all of the base types or scoped?
Maybe Stefan, I can take this over.
Yeah, give it a try.
So first of all, this is a complex PR. Please take your time to take a look. Second, we are not basically compatibility or back compatibility is something that we cannot and we are not influencing.
Okay.
It is a PI, it is a PI server stuff. So if you downgrade to a version where that is older than what is in CD, API server does not work. It is the same that apply for core CRD and for core types and CRD. We are not touching those guarantees from the API server. Those are constraints of the underlying system.
Okay. So makes sense. Just was making sure. So yeah, I think I see this. And another thing is once we have this merged, will be I mean, it will be up to the users, right, to update, and all the versioning will already be in place. I mean, I should probably look at the PR, and I will. But since we are at this, maybe if I'm not taking too much time, of course.
The agenda is fairly light, so I think we can spend a few more minutes on this topic.
Yeah. I'm just not sure if I got a question. So yes, if this PR is merged, it's still up to the users to upgrade Cluster API, but it's always up to the users, right? We're not just automatically going to upgrade Cluster API for them.
Okay, and you mentioned the migrator there, which is the operator, right, for this kind of a thing, which could be used as a standard. I mean, would that be something that we would call a standard? For example, especially integration with end-to-end or CI/CD processes.
Maybe the answer to this is let's go through the upgrade plan and in the issue, and you will get your answer. What happened when you upgrade?
And also look at the PR, please.
I have my cluster ready. I will be.
It's not like we build our own version of the Cluster API operator that is upgrading Cluster API itself. What we're talking about is we're talking about having an additional reconcile loop in our existing providers. They're essentially taking care of the corresponding CRDs, right? So we deploy core Cluster API. Usually it's only reconciling the cluster object and it's creating like the cluster stuff. What this one is now doing on top is it makes sure that all the cluster objects are basically in a good state. It looks at the managed fields of those cluster objects and it gets rid of stuff that shouldn't be there. It makes sure that all the cluster objects are stored in the right version etcd. So it's part of the core copy binary. It's not like an additional thing deploying the core copy controller or doing any other sort of weird stuff there. All of this stays the same. It's just that all our providers would have some some embedded reconciler that basically just makes sure that you never run into problems around CRD migration. That's what it will be from a high level.
I see.
That's-
Okay, that clarifies it a little bit. So I think the providers here is quite important to mention. Right, because you cannot just update your, I don't know, worker pools and have something broken within the machine set or deployment. So I suppose, how do we integrate? Do we even define those things, or is it more like providers define this and we integrate? If I'm asking for too much, then don't answer.
I don't know what you mean, define this. I mean, we are
I mean,
literally adding an additional controller in our controller binary.
Yes.
Right?
So
Core copy
there-
has an additional controller in there.
Yeah, exactly. But you said that there'll be differences depending on the provider. So let's say there's some software as a service that provides you that kind of a service, and there's some other one which potentially could not allow for the migration, for example, right? Or the version upgrade. So shouldn't that be generic? Like independent, shouldn't that be independable from the providers?
Can you open the PR, please?
Or just generic?
And then main.go in the top level. I think you can just scroll down all the way, probably on the left. Yep.
Which main dot is at the bottom?
The top level one is on the bottom. So on the left sidebar, if you scroll down to the bottom, and then the last file probably is main. Yeah. Sorry, it's roughly in the middle now of your screen because the test folder is at the bottom.
I know, there's like 6 main.gos in this. Like,
yeah, I know. I had to touch all of them. So let's just take a quick look at how this looks for the core copy controller, right? So what you're saying is basically, hey, there's a CRD migrated component. We add an additional command line flag here, which is basically allows you to skip certain stuff if you don't want it. Then let's skip over the RBAC markers. We just need a bunch more permissions to all of this stuff.
Yep.
Okay. Then here we plug in that controller. Essentially, we say, hey, CRD migrator in core copy, please take care of cluster resource bindings, clusters, machine deployments, machine generals, machine life checks, all of that stuff.
Okay.
Then we give it a client and an API reader in line 513 or something. And we add it to our manager. And that's it. And now if you are like, I don't know, the CapD controller, then you have to do the same stuff, but you have to add your own CRDs here. And then basically CapD will take care of its own resources. We wanted to add this here essentially in that way so that just basically every provider can take care of their own CRDs if they want to, right?
Yeah.
We added this to the Bootstrap provider, to KCP, and to CapD in this PR.
Okay.
Technically, you could build like one single additional controller that takes care of everything. But I mean, it's not a component that we have to ship, that we have to install, that we have to upgrade. That
would be too much of an overhead. Yes, I understand.
That also needs permissions on everything. So the core copy controller still only has permissions on its own resources in this one and not on like everything.
Yeah, of course, encapsulation is important. I understand. Yeah. So there are like a bunch of modules here. You're updating the base types. You generate the types after the types defined, and the copy, and you just set up manager here for the versioning. And the question about I mean, just it's quite a PR, but features gates enabled here. I can see here. So let's say there is a feature gate enabled on the control plane, and then this will basically. Okay. So then if then feature if cluster topology, then
probably we should do
I see.
PR.
Yeah,
I would do PR reviews in actual PR reviews and not in office hours too.
Yeah, I'd like to step in here a little bit, and I know our agenda is not heavy today, and I appreciate your questions, Pavel. I think it's good, to understand these things. But at this point, I would recommend give a review on that PR, Pavel, and please raise your questions in the comments there, because the questions you're asking are good, and they'll be good for the rest of the community if we can have it in a public place where we can have answers and everything. So I think your questions are good, but let's focus on the review and then come back.
Makes sense.
I see you guys. Oh, sorry. What were you going to say, Pablo?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
All right, cool. Joel, please.
Yeah, I've just got one question on the there were some tables on the issue around the version
Yes.
compatibilities.
Yes.
So we're looking at N-3. So
Yeah.
does that mean I can upgrade directly from V110 to 113 or 110 to 114? I wasn't quite
10 to 13.
10 to 13. Okay. So what I was trying to work out, and I'm assuming you've thought about this, is there any ordering issue of upgrading the CRD schema or upgrading the controllers first because of that? And I think in the later table, it makes sense to me. We've got changes happening, and then several releases later, we're saying the thing is removed. But I wasn't sure if, like, I don't know if I'm wording this correctly, but is there a possibility that we upgrade the controller first, it runs the migration stuff that you've built, and then the CRD schema is changed later just because of the way that someone is rolling this out? Or does all of the version migration stuff completely mitigate that and we don't need to worry about it?
I think we don't have to worry about it because the way it's stretched out. So I was testing this locally a little bit, and I was going widely back and forth between storage version Alpha 3 and Alpha 4, even with like the same copy control from main, and they run into some edge case. But I think in reality, those edge cases don't happen. So I think what essentially is guaranteed by the controller is, let's say you go from 110 to 111, right? That's the point where the storage version changes. So if you first upgrade the controller won't do anything. I mean, before the COD, right? If you upgrade the controller first and then the COD, basically the controller will see the new event on a COD with a new generation. It will run through the entire thing, and then it will update the observed generation on a COD. Similar things happen when you go from served to unserved. I think what would be problematic potentially is if you go from, let's say, 110 to 118 or something. But I think that's problematic in general because you're going from one version that does not have beta 2 to another COD that does not have beta 1, and that's blocked by the API server. So as far as I could think through the problem and was trying around, and the edge cases I hit when I did stuff that are technically not supported, I think we should be good. Because in any case, there is a guarantee that a COD migrator will run with a specific generation of the COD. It will do whatever it's necessary, and then will say, oh, I'm done for this generation. And whenever we change something that is relevant, the generation will go up, which then leads eventually to another reconcile of the controller. And I think it should not matter if that controller is using the old or the new version of copy, because it's pretty independent of that version, I think.
Okay, yeah.
I wouldn't say that I maybe not missed something, some edge case, but as far as I was thinking, it should work.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the key thing is essentially that the controller itself, I mean, it registers a certain version of our API types, like beta 1 or beta 2 or something. But the stuff that it's actually doing, I think it does not depend on that. Because when it triggers the storage version migration, it will just do a write call with the current storage version that is in the CRD. So it doesn't really matter if that controller is using beta 1 or 2, it will just use the right thing. I think it's just important that we don't go too quickly from, like from storage to unserved or something like that. But the way this stretches out over time, it should not happen. I think I'm not explaining this well.
No. I think I've got you. I think you've gone through everything I was thinking through. The only other question I had was around, so like when you're writing to CRDs, sorry, when you're writing CRs, it's going to update the status, which doesn't increment the generation.
Yes,
but I think you're right. If as long as we've changed the storage version, that's not going to revert anything we've just done. So
I noticed Fabrizio raised his hand. I don't know if he had a response to what was going. Did you have a response, Fabrizio, or another question?
No, please. It is something to add on top. Please finish this topic.
I think I'm done there. I think it's this is hard to think through, and I was trying to think through it the other day and just wanted to double confirm. But it sounds like Stefan's been very thorough.
I try to be. Yeah.
Go ahead, Fabrizio.
Just adding that in parallel, we are trying to keep moving the discussion in API server to get a proper fix. Ideally, down the line, we should basically leverage on the storage migration when all the version that we support, when this feature graduates and all the version that we support can use storage migration. And ideally, API server should take care of cleaning up managed field automatically. But we know in Cluster API we have a long Kubernetes support matrix. And so it will take some time before we can use core API server feature to do this work. And this is why we Stefan mostly invested a lot of effort in trying to do this in the cleanest and simplest way.
Yeah. Maybe just one thing to add. Even after the storage version migrator in the API service GA, we can basically only, let's say, rebase on top of it. So we would still have to make sure that essentially something, maybe us, is creating basically the storage version migration objects to trigger the migration in the API server. But yeah, otherwise totally agree. I mean, just in addition to that. But
so basically, so basically, it's not out. Not every object is automatically garbage collected in some case of migration. So what if there was ongoing migration and it like failed in the middle because of something, I don't know, edgy? The DAO just reconcile and be like, revert instead of commit, and will be able to use the previous one. Maybe it should. Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm trying to.
In general, there is no commit in Kubernetes, and there is
no because
word for us.
What
can always happen when we run through those migrations is that individual requests are failing. But in those cases, we are just going to reconcile and continue. And the controllers, or the two phases in that controller, are implemented in a way that they are not just always starting from scratch. If let's say you have like 2,000 machines, and after 1,000 machine, one request fades or something. The way that the stuff is written, it will just continue and not just start from the first machine again or something like that. So you'll notice a bunch of optimizations when you look at the code changes, like trying to not use any additional memory, trying to cache that we just already did something so that we don't, in those error cases, repeat from scratch, and a bunch more.
Okay, so that's the statement. Okay, and the discussion. I see.
I would just add a few more things about the issue. I try to keep it short, but just for timelines, because I want to talk about that stuff, actually. Can you scroll up just a little bit? Maybe like, yeah, that's enough. Okay. So yeah, implementation, TLDR. Take a look at the PR if you're interested. Also take a look at the notes for providers if you are a provider offer, and you also want this component to take care of your CRD migration if you go through different API versions in your provider. Definitely feel free to ping me somewhere if you want more details or something. Okay, so now the actual point. So the idea is to have a component in place which takes care of those migrations so that we're now ready to actually remove API versions. And then now here with removal of V1, R3, R4, basically this would be like the current idea on when we can actually drop stuff. A little bit of context is just in general context. So Copy today basically supports, just in general from a support perspective, supports 2 old versions. So basically at the moment we support 1.9 and 1.8. And what we do for 1.7 is essentially that we keep CI around. And if we need an emergency patch for security reasons, whatever, the third version is basically also like, let's say, partially supported. So like Kubernetes, we basically support like 3 old patch versions, so minor versions, to a varying degree. And then what we have at the moment is that when we're talking about upgrading between cluster API versions, we are testing from n-3 to 1. So like Joel was asking, so 1.10 to 1.13 would be one example, what we want to support. We have a bit of a documentation gap there. Fabrizio volunteered to maybe clean up the language. But our goal would be essentially that you can jump upgrade from n-3 to n. So at least from a core copy perspective, it would be possible to only upgrade cluster API itself once per year, and you don't have to go through all the intermediate versions. So that's what we aim for, and that's also why those timelines are looking like they are, because essentially what we need is that the storage version migration is run at a certain point in time. We need that managed field cleanup is run at a certain point in time. And that's why we have to stay in certain phases. for a few versions so that this jump upgrade from n-3 to n is still possible. First example, alpha 3, alpha 4. So we had them since I don't know how many years. The current status that alpha 3 and alpha 4 are not served. So what we have to do in this phase, essentially, we have to clean up the managed fields. So if we merge this PR in time, we will basically be here in 1.10. We added a CRD migrator, and we are in served faults. So that means, essentially, if you deploy Kabi 1.10, managed field cleanup will be taken care of. If you jump over 1.10, it will be taken care of in 1.11 or otherwise in 1.12. Based on the n-3 to n policy, you will bump to either 1.10 or 1.11 or 1.12, but you won't skip over all of them. So we can be sure this stuff is actually run. And now that we're sure that it was run, basically with 1.13, we can actually drop alpha 3 and alpha 4. So that's probably like 4 years after we removed it for the first time or something. I don't remember. At the one that we had to revert. So that's the idea here. And then if you look at like the next cycle that we have in front of us, which is like the V1 beta 1 and V1 beta 2 thing, that's the next table, if you want to scroll down a little bit, but it's also fine as is. So the current state essentially is with the, or that's the current plan, right? I mean, it can change, but that's the current plan. So next release 1.10 in a month or in 2, we only have beta 1. It's served, of course, so you can use it with get and list and all of that stuff. It's available. And it is currently a storage version. Then we would introduce beta 2. At a time when we introduce beta 2 becomes a storage version. That means after every create and every update request, the objects will be actually stored in beta 2 in etcd. This is also the time when essentially the storage version migration kicks in. So basically, if you upgrade from 1.10 to 1.11, the CRD migration component would run over all your custom resources and trigger a no op write essentially, so that all of them are stored in beta 2. This will happen either in 1.11, 1.12, or 1.13, depending on which versions you're jumping over. But in one of them, it will happen because you cannot jump over all of them again. And then basically the other phase repeats. If we go to 1.14, we are at a point in time where beta 1 is not served anymore. We have to wait for that to clean up managed fields, because as long as it's served, we have to keep the managed fields around. But as soon as it's not served anymore, we can start with managed field cleanup. So basically, we again have 3 versions. There's nuance here. But again, we have basically 3 versions time where we actually run the managed field cleanup. You probably noticed that this phase is 4 versions, 4 rows high. The idea here is essentially those API version changes are big changes. There are probably like a lot of people out there who only actually notice that they are still using beta 1 anywhere once they turn beta 1 actually off. And turning beta 1 off from a user perspective is the moment when you go to served faults. So what we want to do is essentially that we add 1 buffer release here. So the served faults phase is essentially 4 releases long and not just 3. So that if you notice after you upgrade to 1.14 that, hey, I still have to keep beta 1 a little bit longer because I just need time to migrate to beta 2, then you can still revert to that. But we will, because of that buffer release, we still have enough time to go through our managed field cleanup. Yeah, and then finally, December 27, Christmas, hopefully, we can remove beta 1. Yeah, I'll leave it there. I know it's like a complex topic. I don't know how easy it was to understand.
No, we spent a good amount of time on this. Good discussion. Thank you for all the questions, everybody, and helping clarify. The next steps for anyone in the meeting or listening, please go review this PR. And if you are curious about how it works or have questions about details in it, ask Stefan lots of questions, because Stefan likes answering questions, especially on pull requests. So, and I'm not being facetious at all. This is a great place. Have the discussion here. You can see Joel's already taking the opportunity to ask lots of questions. So please follow up. Christian as well, taking a good look there. And yeah, thank you, Stefan. This is a complicated topic. There's a lot of moving parts. So everyone, please take a look. Okay. So the next topic, Mark and Mohammed, about the OCM usage with CAPI namespace separation PR. So please, Mark and/or Mohammed, take it away.
Hey everyone. So can I have a share screen? I want to.
Yeah, sure. Let me make you co-host. 1 second. I will stop sharing. You should be free to share now, Mohammed.
Okay. Can I? Just a second.
Working for you?
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out how to do sharing.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
You guys can see my screen, yes?
Yep, I can see it.
Okay, cool. So during the proposal comments in the BR, I see a lot of bit of misunderstanding and confusion about what is the proposal is trying to do. So I just will go quickly what is our exact use case here, and then we can go in details on some technical problem that in the comments has been mentioned. So first of all, what is Open Cluster Management, which is the tool we're trying to leverage the use of it with CAPI. It's a Open Cluster, it's a cloud native project. Its main function is to manage clusters, Kubernetes clusters in day two to deploy workload or security policy or extra. And it does not provision clusters, it's just day two operation, deploying workload and security policy. And as a bit of concept here, was like to make close the gap between the terminology in the CAPI and OCM. So this is like the typical deploying model. You have one cluster, which you name it as a hub cluster, which is the one that is used to roll out all the workload or the policy that you want into the managed cluster. So the hub cluster, we can say it in CABI terminology, is the management cluster, if that can make sense. And the as an end user using OCM, I have to register my managed cluster by myself to the hub cluster. So every hub cluster in its own need to have a registration from each managed cluster in order to be able to communicate with it and then deploy workload and whatever policy we want. At the same time, the hub cluster has a concept of placement that can be used to select a group of clusters. So I have these two clusters, for example, in the placement one, like the RDev, this one is broad. So when I have a placement dev here, that's mean I'm talking to these two clusters. And when I have a placement broad, I'm talking to this one. This is like a general understanding of what is OCM. And then the spoke cluster here, this one is the managed cluster. And the way that managed cluster is being communicating with the hub cluster is through an agent model. And every cluster of those having a namespace is being created in the hub cluster by the cluster name in order to provide isolation between clusters artifact. Is it cool so far? So,
Yep, so far so good.
okay, cool. So the next step now, we are trying to deploy CAPI at the same hub cluster where OCM is deployed. So at the same time, when CAPI provision clusters, like cluster 1, cluster 2, cluster 3, those clusters will be auto-imported to the hub cluster, and then the workload and the security policy can be rolled out. So it's as simple as that. So here in the first diagram, we said the end user must register those clusters one by one to the hub cluster. Here, by using CAPI in the same cluster as the OCM cluster hub, then this auto import could happen by itself. And in OCM, we have adding this as a feature that any CAPI and CAPI provider, the provisioning a cluster with the same cluster that OCM is installed, he can auto import those clusters to OCM. So now we come to the use cases that this proposal is trying to solve. First one here, this is the hub clusters and having CAPI and OCM deployed, the hierarchical deployment. And this cluster is also provision some clusters, which is being used, one of them to provision another cluster. So we have a kind of multi-tier or multi-tier, multi-tree architect of deploying clusters. But the point is, for the first cluster here, we have a CAPI that is running. And we need this CAPI instance when it's running to be limited to a group of namespaces that can access this CAPI instance. Simple example, we have a dev namespace, cluster dev namespace, and a cluster stage namespace. And we want the copy instance that is running here to be able to run the copy component under this only two namespaces due to isolation and kind of security stuff that is required here in this hub cluster. And then once those clusters get provisioned, one of those clusters is managing itself using also copy component. So the cluster itself having a copy component that be used to add machine pool, add whatever component to the cluster. And the same cluster is used with the copy to provision another clusters as well. So in this case, we have two copy instance with the same version, not different version, like same for 1.9, 1.10. And one of them is only need to be restricted to the cluster namespace that managing this Owen cluster. And the other copy is open for any namespace. Like it does not require to be running in a specific namespace. It's just need to be, able to create cluster, but it must not make a conflict with this copy component that is managing this cluster. Is it clear so far? Any questions for the use case?
No one is raising their hands. In response to your question, is it clear so far? I can only speak for myself, Mohammed. I think you're explaining it well, but this is a extremely complicated use case.
Yes.
So I appreciate the depth you're going into and the slides and everything, but it is very complicated. Stefan has raised his hand. Please, Stefan.
Yeah, definitely thanks for explaining. That definitely clarifies a lot of things. I'm just wondering what we can do there. So
Yeah, so
my problem is a little bit, we're coming basically from a world where we're saying like, we support one copy instance for management cluster, right? And that's it. And even multi-tenancy, you can do it on your own. That's fine. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. If you're trying to support all of this, I don't know, this will put a lot of constraints on a project. I don't know what we can even do. I mean, you were even mentioning running like a copy 1.9 and the 1.10 in the same management cluster, which means they have to be able to run with a different version of their COD, which seems like,
yeah,
can
so
we even change your API types anymore if we sign off on this?
so can I so
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, I just want to reply back to you. So we are not saying we are running 1.9 and 1.10 in this proposal at all. So all the copy instances that you see here, they are all 1.9 or they are all 1.10.
Sorry, then I misunderstood. Maybe.
Yeah, so there is no, I see, because I see there's a history about multi-tenancy in the community here, but like I feel everybody is commenting on the enhancement, having this background of this, but we are not talking about this at all. So what we are trying to do here, for example, for this first case. So I intentionally make it complex to break it down into one by one, and then talking what we can do here. So for this one, for the first, we say like the global cluster. This one, we just need to be able to run copy, just one instance of copy, watching multiple namespaces. Simple reason for that is security isolation. This is a hub cluster that managing another hub clusters. So a restrict isolation need to be applied. So for a single copy instance, as of today, you can run copy instance watching a single namespace. What we want is watching 2-3 namespaces in order actually to avoid running multiple copy instances. So this one is actually might be somehow in the favor of not running multiple copy instance in this deployment, in this one, in the high level one. For this one, the second one, those are the same copy version. They are not different. But this one is manage the cluster, machine pools. So we need this another copy version that is running to provision those, not conflicting on this one. Also due to isolation and security, restrictions. So we need this copy version exclude watching a namespace that owned by this one. and both are same copy version. Both are 1.9 or 1.10 or 1.8. There is no conflict. There is no CRD problem with this two. There is no kind of, any multi-tenants, multi-version copy instance problems we should see here. So,
Okay, I mean, we're running tight on time, so I want to make sure everyone gets a
yeah,
chance to have the discussion here. And Fabrizio's got his hand up, so please, Fabrizio.
go ahead.
If you kindly go back to the previous slide. So
The voice is a
one
bit.
comment
Yeah, to the
and
previous
one,
slide.
yes, one comment and one question.
Sure.
So it is not true that Copy today support running with a single namespace. I will call it a technical debt, something that we did not delete it, but we are not. If you read the book, it's saying you can try to use it, but it is at your own. I will say at your own risk. Second, I really struggle a little bit to understand what do you mean about isolation. And we can probably try to answer this in two levels. For instance, in the ABA cluster, why you need to prevent copy from reading from search from other namespaces? What is the issue? If there are no cluster in those namespaces, it should just work.
Well, okay, so let's get back then to this one. So you said here this one. So every manage the cluster here, having a namespace get created here by its own name. And every one of those is managed itself by a copy instance. So as a restrictions, this one, it should not be able to, kind of managing this one, manipulating its machine as this one is become managing itself.
But this is because we are mirroring back the cluster in the cluster down in the managed cluster up in the ABA cluster as a way to register it.
Yes.
Okay, so that means that so you are using cluster API to register a cluster, and you don't want cluster API to act on those clusters. Just pause it, apply a pause label on them. Why not?
Well, that could be as well like a work to do it, but it's more for isolation because it's not just managing the cluster component. There are also a workloads. So it's not just managing the cluster. There are a bunch of workload like any deployments, custom resource that those cluster will be doing will be
Yeah, but
created.
those are not something that cluster API cares about.
Yeah, but it's more in isolation. This is like as a requirement from isolation between the namespaces. We can apply rules as well, like cluster rules as well to prevent that. But one of the ideas is using namespace, it make it a solid isolation. Like there are many workarounds we can apply. I understand.
And why cannot use airbag to do such isolation?
Yeah, we
Instead
can.
of giving a cluster API global access to all namespaces, you can restrict it to namespace using airbags.
Wait. But if
We
you
can. That's fine. We can as well. That's no problem that we can do this. It's possible. Like I'm not saying this is not possible.
wait a second. So if you give cluster API only access to specific namespaces, let's say for the cluster object, and you only change airbag, then cluster API won't work anymore because it will still try to create a cluster-wide watch for the cluster object, right? So whatever airbag changes you make and restrict certain namespaces, you have to basically adjust the cache configuration in the same way. Otherwise, copy won't even start.
Well, it could be, to be honest, I
So
didn't
airbag itself won't fix that problem.
Okay, that's a good point. But then I go back. So cluster API is expected to manage cluster, and now what they're doing is that you are trying to use cluster API CR not to manage cluster, but to as a way to inform another system that those clusters exist and how they are done. Of course, the system is not designed for this, and I don't. You can. I'm not even sure we should take care of this use case. If you want, we can try to support this by, oh, there is a pause annotation. You copy and you tell cluster API to ignore it. But honestly, telling cluster API, oh, there are clusters that you should ignore, seems like why you should support this.
Well,
It is very confusing to me. You are using, it's like, oh, I create a pod in Kubernetes, but I tell Kubernetes, please ignore my pod. API server, please ignore my pod.
say it again, Fabriazo, what you mean by that?
It is like telling, oh, I'm using Kubernetes, I create pods,
Okay.
but I don't want the Kubernetes reconcile my pods. It is the same request.
Well, I don't want to recount my board under a certain namespace, but if it's written
Yeah,
under
but
this,
you cannot do this. Kubernetes is designed to manage pods in all namespaces. And,
yeah,
and
but
the same
namespace is used for isolation as well. Like, I'm not getting your point.
namespace is used for name isolation,
Yes.
not for reconcile isolation. So namespace are not a tenant boundary or are a very weak tenant boundary. They provide just a place. You can call two objects with the same name into different namespaces. This is all they are. Then they give you something a little bit more. Yeah, you can apply resource quota or airbag, etc., etc. But namespace does not impact how controller manager works. And
How
this
is
is the
that
same
trivial?
for
I just don't want to let us be, but I'm not really getting the point. It's to
okay,
me,
we can take this
Yeah,
offline because we are also
yeah.
at the end of the
Let
meeting.
let's pause for 1 second here because Joel has also had his hand up for about a minute, and I just want to. Joel, did you have a response to that or a different question? Or
Well, it was kind of about the user story. I wasn't sure if I saw this or heard this, but the one of the user stories I heard for this was around you have let's say there's a cluster admin, right? And they have their own cluster, and that is using Cappy to self-manage its scale, its it's got machine sets, machine pools, machine deployments, all of that stuff to manage itself.
Yes.
But then they also want to provide the ability to other users to manage their own cluster API through that. And this is something we've seen several times from several different customers is this kind of request. But the request often comes with, we would like to not have the cross-contamination of the ones we're managing by themselves, then also the same controllers running the customer workloads. So there are two options I see for this. There's one that is like every of those customer clusters has to run their own Cappy controllers and use the individual namespace isolation. Or you say, okay, well, we'll have one for us manage our own stuff, and we'll provide one for the customers to manage theirs, and then they all share one, and we have our own kind of isolated. I just wanted to add that in case that helped some of the understanding for folks.
it helped my understanding a little bit because I've heard this like several times now, and every time I hear it, it like confuses me a little more or a little less. But what it sounds like though is the feature that you want here is like a shared management cluster, right? Where it's like we make a management cluster, and now the users of that management cluster want to be able to run their own cluster APIs in the management cluster so they can do other cluster API stuff. And to
Yes.
me, that starts to smell a little weird. Like if you have a management cluster and you have users on the management cluster, and then you want to subdivide the cluster API so that users of the management cluster could use their own cluster API in their own namespace to do their own thing. Like, why wouldn't you create another management cluster for that user to operate from? That seems like a much simpler model than trying to go this way.
Yeah, but it depends on the scale. So we here just watching three cluster, but in a scale, it becomes more complicated. Like when you have 500 clusters, you need to have a hub of hub, like a management of management. So it
Right.
becomes make more sense in this scale. But for a smaller scale, yeah, it not make sense at all. I know, but I'm just
Okay.
simplifying.
Yeah. No, fair enough. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Stefan, go ahead. I'll let you get the last comment in here, and then we got one more piece of business before we
Yeah,
close.
I try to be quick. Yeah, I think one point that we're not getting is if, as you were saying, we have like, let's stick to upstream wording here. Let's say you have one management cluster, you have a bunch of clusters in some namespaces, a bunch of clusters in other namespaces. Why does it make a difference for you which copy controller is reconciling which? If basically you're saying the copy controllers, they will be the same version, they will be running the same code. What is the upside of having like all the providers running twice instead of just once if they're actually doing like the same thing as you, like you would have just one instance of all of this? I think that's one of the points that we're
That's
missing.
memory
Like,
isolation, right? Like if you have two customers who are separate running on the same management cluster, they would have to have separate controllers running to keep the memory separate, right?
but this breaks with cluster-wide objects. And I don't know if you already
I
have
agree.
a
I
solution
agree.
for like webhooks, right? Because we're currently, the proposals seem pretty much focused on configuring like the informers. They were not really worrying about what happens if you have like one webhook. That webhook is getting related objects. And you know, basically it needs objects of all namespaces to be able to serve webhooks for all namespaces. So we also need something for webhooks to solve that problem. If we want to basically make sure that every controller only has the objects of the classes in those namespaces in memory. And I have no idea how it would work with cluster-wide objects to get that sort of memory isolation.
So in terms, just replying back, so in terms of webhook isolation, webhook, it's more like you validating your custom resource. So in terms of memory isolation is not like there is no
Or
execution of there. So if you're talking about security, it's not really execution, it's just about validating your custom resource. And similarly, if there are two same copy versions, we're not really having a big problem, in filtering this. But it need more investigation. I understand that they need to solve the full use case and apply really memory isolation. It need more investigation. But guys, by in the end of the day, what Merrick was proposing here for these two filters has no conflict with the statement that CAPI is saying we are not supporting multi-instance CAPI version running. This one is basically allowing to watch multiple namespace, and the other one is basically allowing to exclude namespace from being watched. So it should be, if you guys can give it a look, this will serve, like this 2BR will serve the use case that we are watching here. Maybe we have different opinion on how we supposed to manage our stuff, uh, but what we are proposing in this proposal, having no conflict with CAPI statement that we are not supporting deploying multiple instances of CAPI with different version.
Yeah. Okay. I think like
Yeah.
well, first of all, we're a minute over. Christian, I see you raising your hand. I see Fabrizio commenting. Like Mohammed, I think like you've made the case here. I think we're gonna have to discuss this again at another time because
Okay.
I can see Fabrizio saying in the comments we should be dropping flags, not adding them. So I think unfortunately this is becoming a little bit, I don't want to say controversial, but this is like an issue where we're gonna have to talk it through more to get to where we can answer the user story here. I, we're out of time now. There's one more item I need to announce on the agenda. Thank you, Mohammed, for bringing this. If you could make the slides available, that would be awesome. And I would say put this on the agenda for next week. Let's get it in first and have a longer discussion because obviously there's more to talk about here. Let's focus on the user story and try to get to that. If there's a way to enable it and there's a way that we can do it as a community, that would be awesome. I think that we need to understand there are some things that are being proposed here that are not sounding good from the community side, and the community is not wanting to go that direction. So I think we need to discuss it more, maybe understand the problem a little better from the community perspective, and figure out if there's a way that we can kind of work, to address this. So I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to cut it off there because like we're over time. And the last thing I want to say is feature group updates. Um, the node bootstrapping working group, Tilo couldn't make it here today, but he wanted us to, first of all, thank you for merging the working group proposal. That's awesome. The Kube ADM ignition provider has a temporary home now, and you can find the link here in the agenda. And there's some aims on getting that into the Kubernetes SIGs org when it's ready. Currently, there's a lot of maintainer-driven work going on there. Please check it out if you have an interest. Apologies for running over today. Thank you, everyone who could make it.